Another topic that interests me, one that I would like to write a paper about, would be about Theodore Roosevelt and what made him a successful president. I would like to look at his foreign policy and argue that he was in fact successful, especially how he employed his big stick diplomacy. And because that would be a topic, of course, that would be too far large to investigate, I would narrow it down to how he successfully used his foreign policy to exert America's influence in Latin America. Being a Cuban American and a historian, I've always been interested in the United States' historic role in Latin America and Cuba. I lament all the time the fact that the United States helped Cuba win its independence and then instead of taking possession of the island, granted it its freedom. In David Burton's Theodore Roosevelt, Social Darwinism and Views on Imperialism, Roosevelt presented himself as a statesman who policed the Caribbean in the interest of his own country. At the same time, he labored diligently for the welfare and the education of these people in the form and spirit of free government. Anglo-Americans, after generations of struggle, had reached a level of civilization unequaled in human history because they had acquired the requisite for self-rule. Western expansion had justification in the spread of free government so that all might one day enjoy liberty as promised by the nature and the history of man. Roosevelt favored the independence of Cuba, but then he came to understand that Cubans were not prepared by their history or culture for democracy, American style. But in temporarily remaining in Cuba, and as the United States did, the purpose was to lay the foundations of self-government and prosperity. The interplay of might and right was a prominent aspect of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, which revealed the moral attributes of his policies. This source uses books, essays, and articles written by authors about Theodore Roosevelt. It also uses letters by Theodore Roosevelt himself and autobiography and the many speeches that he gave. This gives a concise explanation on the man. In Matthew Oyle's Theodore Roosevelt and the Implements of War, Theodore Roosevelt brought a new generation of leadership to the White House. The young chief executive entered office with confidence and injected fresh dynamism into the presidency. Roosevelt was well prepared and trained for the office, and his training began before he even stepped into the White House. It began with his involvement in the Spanish-American War. It prepared him for the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt's months as a Rough Rider profoundly influenced his life. And the Cuban campaign made him a national figure and convinced him of his worth as a man. Throughout his tenure as president, he would always hark back to the Cuban campaign. The author of this academic journal uses manuscripts and books written by authors about Roosevelt. He also uses letters written by Roosevelt himself to important individuals from Henry Cabot Lodge to Leonard Wood. Finally, in Greg Russell's Theodore Roosevelt's Diplomacy and the Quest for Great Power, Equilibrium in Asia, this article examined Theodore Roosevelt and how he pursued foreign policy in Asia, particularly at ending the conflict, or at least mediating the conflict between the Empire of Japan and the Russian Empire in 1905. Everything that Roosevelt ever did was in the interest of America, and this article explores that. Another question that historians have always asked is why the United States intervenes in other countries, and the article examines Theodore Roosevelt's personal style of diplomacy, which sheds light on all of his dealing with foreign countries. The author uses large amounts of books and volumes written by many authors about Roosevelt. Together, these three academic journals and more found on JSTOR will provide vitally important information to be used as secondary sources as I examine the man and the president who always put America first. Thank you.